Chapter 17. The Mystery of the Shemitah. And then he left. So what happened? I tried to figure out the mystery on the seal. The 6 stalks of wheat, and in some way a 7th, but not there, absent. 6 of one kind, and a 7th of another. It turns out it's a biblical pattern, the days of the week. 6 days of one kind, and a 7th day, the Sabbath, different from the rest. But what do the days of the week have to do with wheat? She asked. I had no idea, but that's all I could figure out. And then he reappeared? Several weeks later, I was driving home from a conference out of state through the countryside. It was a rolling landscape with fields of grain on both sides of the road. On my left, the grain sloped upward to a distant crest. The wind was beating against the stalks, making waves throughout the field. I couldn't help looking at it while trying to keep my eyes on the road, a dance of wind, wheat, sunlight, and shadow. Then I noticed something out of place. At first I thought it was a scarecrow. It was the only thing I could think of. The figure of a man standing on the top of the crest. With a long dark coat? It was him. Not that I could be sure from so far away, but I just knew it. So I pulled over to the side of the road, got out, and made my way through the field up to the crest. "Noriel," he said, greeting me as I approached. "What brings you to these parts?" "Ah, of course. What would bring me to these parts?" I replied. "And would it do any good if I asked you what you're doing standing in the middle of a wheat field? I can tell you I'm not here for the farm work." "I knew it wouldn't do any good to ask," I replied. "I'm here for the same reason you are." I gazed out at the surroundings. The crest wasn't actually part of the field. The wheat stopped just short of reaching it, and we were surrounded not by one field, but several in every direction, each one rolling away from us and up into the distant hills. "So," he said, breaking the silence, "have you figured out the mystery of the seal?" "Something to do with the days of the week." "Why do you say that?" he asked. "There were 6 stalks of wheat, and a 7th one I only knew about because you told me. The 6 were visible, the 7th was not. A pattern of 6 and 7, the same pattern of the biblical week." "You didn't get it," he said, "but you were on the right track." "How so?" "The pattern is correct. 6 of one kind and then a 7th. And each stalk of wheat represents a measure of time. You got that right. But it's not a pattern of days." "Then of what?" "The same pattern given to Israel to mark their days was also given for their years. For 6 years they were to labor, sowing and reaping their fields, pruning their vines, gathering in their harvests. But in the 7th year they would rest. It would be the Sabbath year. The law of the 7th year came to them in the deserts of Sinai through Moses. Thus they were commanded, 'When you come into the land which I give you, then the land shall keep a Sabbath to the Lord. 6 years you shall sow your field, and 6 years you shall prune your vineyard, and gather its fruit. But in the 7th year there shall be a Sabbath of solemn rest for the land, a Sabbath to the Lord.'" "Then each stalk represents a year," I said. "Each stalk represents a harvest." "Correct. And the missing stalk?" "The missing stalk would stand for the 7th year. It's not there because the 7th year is the Sabbath year, so there's no harvest." "Well done," he said. "The 7th year was given a name. It was called the Shemitah. The word Shemitah means the release, the remission, the letting rest. In the year of the Shemitah, all laboring over the land was to come to a rest. There was to be no plowing, no sowing, no pruning, no reaping, no harvesting. The fruits of the harvest would be abandoned, let go. What grows of its own accord of your harvest you shall not reap, nor gather the grapes of your untended vine, for it is a year of rest for the land." "Look over there, Noriel. What do you see?" "A field with no harvest," I answered. "Only the remains of a past harvest. It's fallow ground. The land is resting. In the year of the Shemitah, all the fields of Israel became like that, fallow and resting. But how did they live without a harvest?" They would eat whatever grew of itself. 6 years you shall sow your land, and gather in its produce. But the 7th year you shall let it rest, and lie fallow, that the poor of your people may eat. In the 7th year each landowner was required to open up his land to those in need. The poor would share equally in the fruit of the rich. The land's produce would become, in a very real sense, the possession of all. The wind was now beginning to pick up in speed and strength, its gusts beating down all the more intensely on the stalks of wheat. The resulting waves were now more rapid and dramatic than before. The prophet paused for a few moments as I took it all in, then continued. But the Shemitah, he said, touched not only the fields, but also the people. The last remission took place in an entirely other realm. At the end of every 7 years, you shall grant a release of debts. And this is the form of the release. Every creditor who has lent anything to his neighbor shall release it. He shall not require it of his neighbor or his brother, because it is called the Lord's release. Shemitah. Thus the last letting go of the Shemitah would touch the economic realm and transform it. So in the 7th year, all debts were canceled. Everyone who made a loan had to annul it. Those in debt were released. Anything still owed was forgiven. All credit was nullified. All debt was wiped away. And all this took place at the end of the 7th year, I asked. Yes, at the very end, on one specific day, the 29th day of the Hebrew month of Elul, the last day of the civil year, the very end of the 7th year. So the 29th of Elul was the climax, the focal point, and the finale of the Shemitah, the day when the nation's financial accounts were nullified. But wouldn't the canceling of all debt and the nullifying of all credit cause economic chaos? It could, he said. Most economies are dependent on some sort of system of credit and loans. So the economic repercussions of such a sweeping change would be immense. So immense that over the centuries, the rabbis would seek ways to get around these requirements in the fear that keeping them would cause economic disaster. But it was supposed to be a blessing, I replied, a Sabbath. Yes, a year of release and freedom, a year of rest from one's labors, and of drawing near to God. And yet still, in outward form, it could resemble an economic collapse. But if the Shemitah year was meant to be a blessing, what does it have to do with judgment, or Isaiah 9:10, or America? The Shemitah would have been a blessing had Israel observed it, and not rebelled against God. But Israel did rebel and didn't keep the Sabbath year. And the breaking of the Sabbath year became the sign of a nation that had ruled God out of its life. The nation had no more time for him. The people were now serving idols. Their Sabbath years would be filled not with peace, but with a restless pursuit of increase and gain. The breaking of the Shemitah was the sign that the nation had driven God out of its fields, out of its labors, its government, its culture, its homes, its life. The Shemitah was meant to be a blessing, but in its breaking, its blessing turns into a curse. And what does that mean, I asked. The Shemitah would still come, said the prophet, but not by choice, but by judgment. Foreign armies would overrun the land, destroy the cities, ravage the fields, and take the people captive into exile. And the land would rest, the fields would become fallow, the buying and selling of its produce and the flow of commerce would come to a standstill. Private ownership would become virtually meaningless, and every debt, credit, and loan would in an instant be wiped away. One way or another, the Shemitah would come. Does the Bible connect the Shemitah to judgment explicitly? Yes, he answered. The connection was foretold from the beginning, from Mount Sinai. Your land shall be desolate, and your cities waste. Then the land shall enjoy its Sabbaths, as long as it lies desolate, and you are in your enemy's land. Then the land shall rest, and enjoy its Sabbaths. As long as it lies desolate, it shall rest, for the time it did not rest on your Sabbaths, when you dwelt in it. And it would all be fulfilled centuries later, when the armies of Babylon invaded and ravaged the land, and took multitudes into captivity. The people would remain in exile for 70 years. Why 70? The answer was hidden in the mystery of the Shemitah. 70 was the number of Sabbath years not kept? Correct. But now, with the land lying still for 70 years, the law of the Shemitah would be fulfilled, even if not by choice. Correct again. It's ironic. In the pursuit of prosperity, the people drove God and the Shemitah out of the land. But now it was the Shemitah that drove the people out of the land and their prosperity, nullifying all their gains and increase. And it was the Shemitah, he said, in which was hidden the mystery of the timing. The timing? The timing of their judgment. 70 years for 70 Shemitahs. So the Shemitah is meant to be a blessing, but for the nation that once knew God but has driven him from its life, the Shemitah becomes a sign of judgment. Correct, he said. So now let's piece the mystery together. In order to do that, we must first identify the pieces. Record this. I've recorded everything, I replied. The machine's on. I don't mean that. You have your notepad? Yes. And a pen? Yes. You're a writer, Nuriel. Right. So I jotted down the next part in shorthand as he dictated. The effect and repercussions of the Shemitah extend into the financial realm, the economic realm, and the realms of labor, employment, production, consumption, and trade. Over the course of the 7th year, the nation's production is severely decreased as its fields and vineyards lay fallow. The nation's labor is greatly reduced or comes to a cessation. Its fields become, in part, the possession of all. The buying and selling of the land's produce are restricted. The fruits of labor are abandoned. Credit is canceled and debt is wiped away. For the nation that attempts to rule God out of its existence, the Shemitah changes from a vessel of blessing to a vessel of judgment, the judgment of a nation's prosperity. Did you get all that? He asked. Yes. But what does it have to do with America? America has never had a Sabbath year. That's correct. It was only commanded for one nation. But the issue here isn't the literal observance of the Shemitah, or any requirement to keep it. Then what is the issue here? I asked. The issue here, he replied, is its dynamic, its effect, and its consequence. And what does that mean? The issue is the Shemitah as a sign. The Shemitah as a sign? The sign of the Shemitah, given to a nation that has driven God out of its life and replaced him with idols and the pursuit of gain. The issue is the Shemitah as a sign of judgment, the sign that specifically touches a nation's financial and economic realms. I still don't see how it connects with America. Behind the collapse of Wall Street and the implosion of the American and world economy, behind all of it lies the mystery of the Shemitah. Tell me. The economic collapse of 2008 was set off by a series of trigger events in early September. At that time, about half of the American mortgage market was owned or backed up by two corporations, the Federal National Mortgage Association and the Federal Home Loan Mortgage Corporation, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. That's right, he said. And by early September, both of them, along with the mortgage and housing markets, were teetering on the edge of collapse. On September 7th, in one of the most dramatic economic interventions since the Great Depression, the federal government seized control of both corporations, placing them under government conservatorship, in effect nationalizing them. Their seizure caused global alarm, and then just as the mortgage market was reeling from their collapse, an even more economically cataclysmic collapse was about to take place. The fall of Lehman Brothers. At the start of the 21st century, Lehman Brothers stood at the pinnacle of the world's leading financial firms. But when the subprime mortgage market began to disintegrate, Lehman's standing and assets began to collapse. When the news spread that a deal to rescue the ailing firm had fallen through, its shares plunged along with the stock market. The following day, Lehman Brothers announced a loss of nearly $4 billion. The day after that, the firm's stock plunged another 40%, and news spread that it was seeking a corporate buyer. In the following days, a flurry of emergency meetings took place between the Federal Reserve and the leaders of Wall Street in a frantic effort to prevent Lehman's end. But the effort failed, and on Monday morning, September 15th, 2008, 1 week after the first collapse, came the second, and this time with no safety net to break the fall. Lehman Brothers filed for bankruptcy, the largest bankruptcy in American history up to that date. It would be called the collapse heard around the world. The fall of Lehman Brothers would in turn trigger the collapse of Wall Street and the global financial implosion. The worst economic crisis since the Great Depression, I said. So what does it have to do with the mystery of the Shemitah? In the days of the prophet Jeremiah, with Jerusalem lying in ruins and the people taken away in captivity, the key that held the timing of the nation's judgment was hidden in the mystery of the Shemitah. So there's something in the timing of the economic collapse that's significant? The collapse of Lehman Brothers and the American economy took place over the course of 1 week. It was the anniversary week of another American calamity. 9/11. Yes, 9/11, he said. The collapse of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac happened on September 7th. The collapse of Lehman Brothers began 2 days later, on September 9th, when it lost 45% of its value. It was on September 10th that it announced its loss of almost $4 billion. The following day, its stock took a second precipitous plunge. September 11th. It was that second collapse on September 11th that Lehman's death knell sounded throughout Wall Street and Washington, D.C. It was then that the Federal Reserve set in motion a series of actions and emergency meetings that would end in the fall of Lehman Brothers, triggering the implosion of the American and global economy. It was also on that September 11th that a second fall reached its critical mass, and a second alarm was sounded as the chief executive of AIG alerted the Federal Reserve of New York that his firm was likewise in critical danger of collapsing. 2 alarms of the coming collapse, both sounding on September 11th. So, as the nation was commemorating the calamity of 9/11, a second calamity, one that would ravage the economic realm, was just beginning. And the time separating the two events, 7 years, said the prophet. There were 7 years between the two. 7 years, the biblical period of time that concerns a nation's financial and economic realms. Yes, he replied, and that concerns the judgment of those two realms. 7 years between the first and second shaking. And what happens, Noriel, at the end of 7 years? At the end of 7 years comes the remission. At the end of every 7 years you will have a release, a remission, a canceling of debts. So it was a remission of what exactly, he asked. Of credit and debt, I answered. And what did all these collapses have to do with? Credit and debt, I replied. So not only did the collapse of 2008 take place at the 7-year mark from 9/11, but it specifically concerned the principle of the Shemitah, the collapse of Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, and Lehman Brothers, all concerned the issue of credit and debt. In the case of the first two, the government intervened. It was a bailout. The two corporations were relieved of their debts of over $5 trillion. A remission of debt. The remission of debt, said the prophet, whether temporary or permanent, a form of Shemitah. And in the case of Lehman Brothers? In the case of Lehman Brothers, the remission took on a different form. The government refused a bailout, and the corporation went bankrupt. And by declaring bankruptcy, its debts were wiped away, and its loans were canceled. Another form of Shemitah, he said, another remission of debt. So the American and global financial collapse was triggered by the dynamic of the Shemitah. Yes, and not only triggered by it. What do you mean? I asked. Stock markets are built on investment. Money is given on the assumption that the investment will generate a return. In that sense, it follows the outward form of credit and debt. Beyond this, the investments come not only from individuals, but also from banking institutions, the funds of which represent loans, credit, and debt. But in the year of the Shemitah, credit and debt are nullified. Exactly. The fall of Lehman Brothers set off an avalanche of financial collapses from Wall Street to Asia. It would continue to cause the convulsion of stock markets around the world for several months, plunging them to ever new lows. Massive fortunes were wiped out overnight. The crashing of stock markets across the world meant that the funds invested had vanished and would not be paid back, at least not for the foreseeable future. Both credit and debt, trillions of dollars worth of credit and debt, had in effect been canceled. Every creditor who has made a loan to his neighbor will let it go, will cancel it. A Shemitah. How far back did it go? I asked. The cancellation of debt in the Shemitah. Back to the end of the last Shemitah, he replied, to the last remission of debt. So the Shemitah would wipe away all the debts of the previous 7 years? Yes. And when the stock market crashed in September 2008, how much was wiped away? All the gains of the past 7 years, and then some. And it touched the entire world. It touched the entire global economy in the form of collapsing markets, vanishing investments, government bailouts, corporate and personal bankruptcies, and foreclosures, each of which was, in effect, a financial nullification. So in each case, whether by bankruptcy, by aid, or by vanishing accounts, the burden was remitted, released. Each becomes a form of Shemitah. Not only each, he said, but all, the whole. The global economic collapse was itself one colossal Shemitah, made up of countless smaller ones. How far does the cycle go? I asked. Every 7th year in the past and into the future? The subject is for another time, he said. The point now is the Shemitah as a sign of judgment. You spoke of a specific day when financial accounts had to be wiped clean, when credit and debt had to be nullified. The 29th day of Elul, the end of every 7 years. The Shemitah's final and climactic day, when all remaining loans, credits, and debts had to be nullified. So does the 29th of Elul have a part in the mystery? I asked. With the fall of Lehman Brothers, the stock market would plunge more than 499 points. Over the next several weeks, the world's financial markets reeled wildly from the impact. In response, the United States Congress worked frantically to come up with a plan to reverse the implosion. The result was a bill proposing the largest government bailout in American history. In a surprise turn of events that shocked most observers, the bill was defeated. That morning, September 29th, the New York Stock Exchange began its session with what many saw as an omen. The opening bell wouldn't sound. When news reached the stock market that the rescue plan had been defeated, Wall Street collapsed. In a single day, it plunged more than 700 points. It was the crowning day in the first stage of the global collapse, and in terms of point loss, the worst day in the history of Wall Street. One financial analyst would sum up what happened on September 29th this way. It was this event, more than anything else, that shattered market confidence. Over the next 2 weeks, the Dow fell close to 2,700 points, a decline of almost 25%. The damage had been done. It was the climactic moment of the global implosion, and the greatest single-day stock market crash in Wall Street history. Why did it happen, he asked. Why did it happen just when it did? I didn't answer. He paused before revealing the answer. The greatest single-day stock market crash in Wall Street history took place on the 29th day of Elul, the critical and crowning day of the Hebrew Shemitah. My God, I exclaimed. It was the only thing that could have come out of my mouth at that moment. The day when financial accounts must be wiped away, he said. When credit and debt are nullified. And it all happened on the exact biblical day on which it was ordained to happen. On the exact biblical day specifically ordained to touch a nation's financial realm. And the timing. You said that the Shemitah holds the key to the mystery, to the timing of the judgment. Did you verify it? Anna interjected. Everything the prophet told you? The facts? There was now an unsteadiness in her voice. I did, he replied. And it was all true, she asked. It was all true. It's mind-boggling, she said. The biggest crash in Wall Street history and the collapse of the global economy, all the manifestation of an ancient mystery. It's mind-boggling. I told you it would be. That you did. And there's more. Go on, she said. The prophet spoke of the number 7. The Shemitah, he said, revolves around the number 7. It's the 7th year. It begins and ends in the month of Tishri, the 7th month of the biblical year. It's a mystery of 7s. So could there be a mark left by the Shemitah, a sign of the mystery in the number 7? I'm not getting it, I replied. The greatest stock market point crash in Wall Street history took place on the last and crowning day of the Shemitah. That evening, as the sun went down, it was the beginning of Tishri, the 7th month of the Hebrew year. What triggered the crash was the rejection of the largest government bailout in American history, a sum of $700 billion, I said. And how much of the stock market was wiped away that day? Tell me. That which was wiped away added up to 7%. How many points did that 7% amount to? How many points were wiped away in that largest crash in Wall Street history? I don't know, I replied. 777 points were wiped away that day. 777. On the final day of the 7th year. Do you realize, I asked, how many things would have had to be in place for that all to happen? To come out like that? All of Wall Street, the entire American economy, the entire world economy, every transaction, every stock bought and sold, everything. Everything had to be in its exact position for it all to happen exactly as it did, at the exact time, and to that exact number. Who could have orchestrated all that? God, he replied. I guess he's the only one who could have. Everything I've told you thus far, Noriel, concerns the end of the Sabbath year. But what about the beginning? Did anything happen to signal the beginning of the Shemitah? Good question, I said. It was a rare opportunity to say such a thing to the prophet. The years leading up to the Shemitah were fat and prosperous. Buying, spending, investing, the stock market, the housing market, the credit markets, everything was booming. But as the Shemitah year drew closer, more and more signs of economic danger began to surface. The rate of loan failures and housing foreclosures began to rise. The financial institutions backing up those loans and mortgages now found themselves in crisis. But the first definitive sign of what was yet to come took place a year before the global economic collapse. It happened in Britain, but as a repercussion of the failing American housing and credit market. In early September 2007, Northern Rock, Britain's 5th largest mortgage lender, collapsed. It was the first British institution to suffer a bank run in over a century. By the end of the crisis, Northern Rock would be nationalized. The remission of debt. It was the first such collapse in the growing credit crisis, and a foreshadow of the failures, the collapses, and the interventions that would soon overtake the American and global economy. A first Shemitah. The fall of Northern Rock happened on September 13th, 2007. September 13th, 2007, on the Hebrew calendar, was the first day of the month of Tishri. The first day of Tishri is the day that begins the Shemitah year. So the first major sign of the Shemitah took place on the exact day on which the Shemitah begins. So then, the day of Northern Rock's fall to the day of the greatest stock market crash in history should mark the beginning and end of the biblical Shemitah. And so it does, said the prophet. The exact beginning and end? The exact beginning and end. And what happened in between? In less than a month from the start of the Shemitah, the stock market, which for the previous several years had been rising, reverses its momentum. By early October, its long ascent comes to an end. It begins to fall. As the Shemitah year progresses, the stock market continues its descent, a slow-motion crash. Billions and billions of dollars are wiped away. The remission of credit and debt. With the tightening of credit markets and the plunging of housing prices, increasing numbers of homeowners find themselves unable to make their mortgage payments. More and more begin defaulting on their mortgages, entering foreclosure. The cancellation of loans, another wiping away of credit and debt. And as they default, the firms standing behind those mortgages now find themselves absorbing greater and greater losses. Every creditor must release his debt. And so the economy continues to deteriorate as the absorbing of losses sets off still more crises. Shockwaves reverberate through the financial world as some of the nation's most powerful lending institutions begin to fail. Some are bailed out or bought out through government intervention. Others go bankrupt. Each failure, each remission, each Shemitah triggers the next and the next as the global economy continues disintegrating. Then in late August, early September, as the year of Shemitah enters its last and climactic phase, so too does the financial crisis, with the collapse of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Yes, he said, and then of Lehman Brothers, and then of the global economy, everything reaching the climax on September 29, 2008, the last and climactic day of the Shemitah. Everything following the ancient pattern. Speaking of the ancient pattern, Noriel, read back to me what you took down. So I took out my notepad and began reading back the words of his dictation. The effect and repercussions of the Shemitah extend into the financial realm, the economic realm, and the realms of labor, employment, production, consumption, and trade. Thus, said the prophet, the global crisis began in the financial realm, but didn't stop there. Before long, virtually every economic indicator and every major sector of the economy was affected. The crisis quickly spread into the realms of labor, commerce, production, and consumption. Continue. Over the course of the 7th year, the nation's production is severely decreased, as its fields and vineyards lay fallow. So the crisis, he said, causes industrial production to decline, and in some cases to cease altogether. As demand dries up, corporations downsize, factories cut back on output, businesses close their doors. The nation's labor is greatly reduced or comes to a cessation. So the crisis batters the labor force, workers are laid off, unemployment skyrockets. Its fields become, in part, the possession of all. So private corporations are increasingly bought out, bailed out, and nationalized, or else becoming increasingly subject to the public realm. The buying and selling of the land's produce are restricted. So commerce and consumption suffer a massive decline. Consumers cut back on spending, and sellers grow more desperate to find ways of reviving their sales. The fruits of labor are abandoned. So merchandise sits untouched in stores and piles up in warehouses. The nations that rely most heavily on export trade now suffer extensive economic damage. Credit is canceled, and debt is wiped away. And so, he said, the entire global collapse is a manifestation of the ancient mystery of the Shemitah. I have a question. Ask it. The stock market crash happened on the 29th of Elul, the last day of the 7th year. So that day was the end of a cycle of 7 Hebrew years. Correct, he said. So then there has to be another part to the mystery. That which takes place on the 29th of Elul would be the conclusion of something that began 7 years earlier. And so there should be something that took place 7 years before the crash. Something connected to it, something that led up to it, something that inaugurated the 7-year cycle. So, Noriel, how would you find out if such a thing exists? You'd have to count back 7 years from the crash, which would bring us to what? The year 2001, to September of 2001, the month of 9/11, he said, finishing my thought. So then the 7-year cycle that reaches its conclusion in the global collapse would have had to have begun somewhere around the time of 9/11. It would go along with the Isaiah 9:10 effect. It was 9/11 and the nation's response to 9/11 that led to the economic collapse 7 years later. Good, Noriel. But you were looking for an event of the Shemitah. It would have to be a major event transpiring in the economic realm. And was there such an event? I asked. There was, he replied. What was it? It happened on Monday, September 17th, 2001. It took place in the economic realm, and it would match, and it would foreshadow what would happen 7 years later. And it was? It was the greatest stock market point crash in Wall Street history up to that day. The record would remain intact for 7 years. 7 years until the crash of 2008. Take note, Noriel, of what we have. What do we have, I asked. A 7-year period that begins with a stock market crash and ends with a second stock market crash. We have a 7-year period framed by the two greatest stock market crashes in Wall Street history up to that time. A 7-year cycle beginning and concluding with two massive remissions of credit and debt. Which is what? The Shemitah, I answered. Correct. It happens at the same time as the first and second shaking. And the mystery goes deeper still, he said. What do you think it was, Noriel, that caused the stock market crash of September 17th, 2001? What? I asked. It was 9/11. It was 9/11 that caused the New York Stock Exchange to close down for 6 days, and then, when it reopened the following Monday, to suffer the greatest loss in its history up to that day. The crash of September 17th, 2001 was the aftershock of 9/11. Just as the crash of 2008 was also the aftershock of 9/11, the extended aftershock, the Isaiah 9:10 effect. So each one was an aftershock of 9/11. 2 shakings, and there comes a second. And the two events were inextricably bound together, 7 years apart. This too goes deeper still. The biblical year isn't based on the Western Gregorian calendar, but on the Hebrew lunar calendar. So the 7-year cycle of the Shemitah has to be based not on the Western year, but on the biblical Hebrew year. So no matter what date it is on the Western calendar, the Shemitah will always end on the 29th day of Elul on the Hebrew calendar, which in the year 2008 fell on September 29th, the day of the crash. But in other years, the same day in the biblical calendar would fall on a different date in the Western calendar. And so what happens if we go back 7 years from the greatest stock market crash in history, back to the other greatest stock market crash in history, the crash of 2001, the one directly triggered by 9/11. On what day did it fall on the biblical Hebrew calendar? Tell me. On the 29th day of Elul. It all happened on the 29th day of Elul, the exact same day, the one day of the biblical calendar ordained from ancient times to cause the wiping away of credit and debt. My God, I said, both of them? Both of them, he answered. Anna now appeared noticeably shaken, visibly pale. Noriel paused from relaying the account to address her response. What? He asked. It's astounding, she replied. The two greatest stock market crashes America had ever known, both taking place on the exact same biblical day, separated by the exact period of time ordained in the Bible, 7 years to the day, both occurring on the one biblical day appointed for the wiping out of credit and debt. Absolutely stunning. She paused to collect her thoughts. And nobody saw it? She asked. Apparently not. You were right, Noriel. What do you mean? When you first came into my office and started telling me about this ancient mystery that was supposed to explain everything from 9/11 to Wall Street, to the global economy, to my bank account, I really thought you were crazy. I know. No, I mean actually crazy, clinically crazy. How could you not? It was just way too out there. You'd hear something like this in the movies. or in novels about the supernatural, but not in real life. But I never could have imagined this. How could you have? Accept my apology, Noriel. There's no need. If I were in your place, I would have thought the same thing. It's just so mind-boggling. I know. September 17th. What about it? It came up before, she said, didn't it? It did. Why did it come up before? The Isaiah 9:10 effect. That was it. The interest rates. September 17th was the day the Federal Reserve slashed the nation's interest rates. That's correct. It was the beginning of the extreme post-9/11 suppressing of interest rates, the first concrete act of defiance in the face of 9/11, and that which would lead to the economic collapse 7 years later. So, she said, that would mean that the Isaiah 9:10 effect began on the day of the Shemitah. It would mean that, he replied, wouldn't it? And therefore, she said, it would mean that it was on the day of the first stock market crash in 2001 that the seeds were sown for the second. And that would make sense, he said. Why would it make sense? Because one Shemitah leads up to the next, and the first calamity leads to the second. Now, I have a question for you, Noriel. Ask it. The 29th of Elul comes around once every year, correct? Yes. But there's only one Elul 29 that can close the 7-year cycle. Only one could be the actual day of remission, the one that comes around only once every 7 years. So on which Elul 29 did the stock market crash of 2008 take place? I asked the prophet the same thing. And what did he say? Yes. Yes? It was the one. The crash of 2008 took place on that precise 29th of Elul that comes around once every 7 years, on the one and only day that comes around once every 7 years. Incredible! And do you realize what that means? What? She asked. It means that the other crash, the one that happened 7 years earlier, the one set off by 9/11, the other greatest stock market crash in history, also took place on that exact 29th of Elul that comes around only once every 7 years. So then, the two greatest Wall Street stock market crashes not only happened on the same day on the biblical calendar, and on the one day of the biblical year ordained to wipe away credit and debt, but each one fell 7 years apart on the exact once in 7 years occurrence of that one Hebrew day. It's beyond amazing, and yet real. And what else did the prophet tell you? I asked him if the biblical Shemitah was still observed. Yes, he said, in the form of ritual. Then was the ritual of the Shemitah taking place on the day of the crash? I asked. It was, he answered. As religious Jews were observing the conclusion of the Shemitah, closing the 7th year, in ritual acts, symbolically wiping away their credits and debts, on the same day, the force of a more mysterious Shemitah was operating, causing Wall Street to collapse and astronomical sums of credit and debt to be wiped away, not in symbol, but in reality. But the mystery of the Shemitah could not have been manifested if 9/11 had never happened. And just when it did, at that exact time, without 9/11, the stock market would never have crashed on the 29th of Elul. So 9/11 had to be woven into the mystery of the Shemitah. It had to be, he answered, and it was. And for the crash of 2008 to have happened 7 years later, exactly 7 biblical years later, to the day, all the key events from the fall of Lehman Brothers, to the vote on Capitol Hill, to the actions of the Federal Reserve, to the entire global crisis, to every other event that affected the economic realm, from politics to war to culture, every event had to also be a part of the same ancient mystery. They had to be a part, he replied, as they were. I couldn't finish the thought. I couldn't think of any word to describe what it was. Just at that point, the wind again picked up in intensity, sweeping rapidly over the fields and extending the pause in our conversation. And one more thing to note, he said. turning to look directly into my eyes. The Hebrew word Shemitah has one other meaning, which is the fall, or the letting fall. As in a collapse? As in a collapse. So you could translate Shemitah as the year of the fall, or the year of letting fall. And that's the mystery of what happened, isn't it? Yes, behind everything. The fall of the stock market, the fall of the housing market and credit market, the fall of commerce and business and trade, everything fell. Every bankruptcy, every foreclosure, every financial failure, every plunge of every major economic indicator, the global collapse itself, everything was a fall. And the entire global collapse began with the fall of Lehman Brothers. Which was not only a fall, I said, it was a letting fall. The Federal Reserve decided to let it fall. Yes. So the entire global collapse began with the American government performing an act of Shemitah. And it goes deeper still. How? No human hands could have orchestrated the countless actions, reactions, and transactions required to cause Wall Street and the global economy to collapse, and for everything to happen just as it did at the exact times ordained in the ancient mystery. Then by the hand of God, said the prophet. It was his Shemitah. It was his letting fall. His letting fall of the American economic world order. With the collapse of the global economy, new challenges to American power and leadership would be unleashed, a foreshadowing of the ultimate end of the American-led global order. And all triggered by 9/11, I said. And all a prophetic message, he replied, just as it was in the days of the prophet Jeremiah, as he gazed out at a land devastated, devoid of its fruits and harvests, as he fathomed the sign of the Shemitah, the sign given to the nation that has forgotten its foundations, placed its trust in its powers and prosperity, and ruled God out of its life. And now it appears again, as a sign to another nation that has likewise ruled God out of its life, a sign to give warning to that nation that apart from his presence, its blessings must turn into curses, and its prosperity must become its judgment. We stopped speaking and just stood there, watching the wind sweep over the fields. It had to have been a good 2 minutes before the silence was broken by the prophet with a question. Are you ready, Noriel? Ready? For the next mystery. I don't know. I'm still trying to absorb this one. It's a lot to take in. You have the seal? Yes. So I returned it to him, and he in turn then handed me another. Are you sure you meant to give me this one? I asked. Why? It's the scroll. It is. You've already given it to me, 2 times before. And now a third. It's the prophecy, Isaiah 9:10, I said. So what am I supposed to see in it that I haven't already seen before? Nothing, he said. What do you mean? It's not in the seal. It's in the giving. I don't understand. How many times have I given it to you now? 3 times. So there comes a third. A third what? A third witness. Chapter 18. The third witness. The third witness. That's all he told me. So there was no other clue, she asked? No. And that was the end of the encounter? Yes. I headed back through the stalks of wheat to my car. The prophet remained in the midst of the fields. Halfway there, I turned back. He was still standing there in the distance, as when I first saw him. Do you need a ride? I shouted back. To where? He replied. I don't know. Maybe to the place of our next meeting. But then we wouldn't be able to meet there, he replied. I reached the car and turned back again. He was still there. I began driving away. I looked back one more time. It had only been a few seconds into the drive, and he was gone. So you really didn't have much to go on this time? No, the slightest of clues, and a seal I had already been given twice before. And I wasn't thinking about either at first. I was still caught up in the mystery that had just been shown, trying to digest it all. It was about an hour into the drive before I began pondering the next one and the meaning of the seal. "But I don't understand," she said. "How could you find anything more? It was already revealed to you twice. What else could it mean? And how were you supposed to figure it out?" That was the hard part. The seal was of the ninth Harbinger, the scroll representing the prophecy, the vow, as proclaimed from Capitol Hill. The second time it was given, it still had to do with the vow, but now the repercussions of that vow, the Isaiah 9:10 effect. "So what would it mean given a third time?" she asked. Apart from the seal itself, I only had one clue. The third witness? Yes, but that's all I needed. How? The first two witnesses had already been revealed. And that was enough for you to know where to go? The seal was linked to a place. Where did each witness recite the vow? In the Capitol. Exactly. And just when it hit me, I passed a sign. For Washington? Yes. And you took the sign as a sign? How could I not take the sign as a sign? Now you're sounding like the prophet. My journey changed. I took the exit and headed to Washington, and specifically to Capitol Hill. It was a couple of hours' drive. When I arrived, it was late afternoon, early evening. I made my way to the Capitol building, to the same steps on which the prophet revealed the ninth Harbinger. And what happened? What happened? What happened is he was there. He was already there. But when you drove away, he was still in the field. Yes, and there was no vehicle in sight apart from my car, yet he was there before me, waiting. "Did you ever ask him how he did it?" she asked. "No. It was enough for me to try to figure out the mysteries. To try to figure out the prophet on top of that would have been too much." So he was standing there on the terrace, in the middle of the steps, overlooking the mall. The sun had either just set or was just about to. The wind was as strong as it had been earlier that day. I made my way up the steps and joined him on the terrace. "You did well to get here so fast," he said, as I approached. "But you were still here before me. Do you remember when we first came here?" "Of course," I replied. "It was when you told me of the ninth Harbinger." The ninth Harbinger, Isaiah 9:10 in the form of prophecy. Here the prophecy was proclaimed on the day after 9/11. Here the nation vowed the vow to emerge stronger than before. 7 years later, the vow would be undone. With the collapse of the economy. Yes, he said. And what event more than any other would bring about that collapse? The fall of Lehman Brothers. And what decision was the most critical in bringing about that fall? The decision of the American government to let Lehman Brothers fall. And when was that decision announced? I don't know. It happened on the first day of emergency meetings in New York City, as the Treasury Secretary informed the leaders of Wall Street that the government had decided not to save the ailing firm. It would let Lehman Brothers fall. It was the most fateful of all decisions in triggering the collapse of the American and global economy. The decision was announced and sealed on the Friday before the collapse, September 12th. September 12th, I said. That was the same day the prophecy was proclaimed on this hill. It was 7 years from the proclamation of the vow to the announcement of the decision that would cause the collapse of its economy to the day. So the economic collapse was triggered on the 7th anniversary of the proclaiming of the ancient vow. Just as in ancient times the same vow would ultimately lead to the collapse of ancient Israel. A very dangerous vow. "Nuriel, do you remember the biblical requirement of witnesses?" he asked. "For a truth to be established," I replied, "or a judgment pronounced, there must be 2 witnesses." "Yes, but another number is also mentioned in Scripture. By the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses the matter shall be established. By the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses every word shall be established. So too in the matter of a nation's judgment. The first witness appears on the day after the calamity to proclaim the ancient prophecy from this hill. The second witness appears 3 years later to deliver a speech centered entirely around the same ancient prophecy. Each would connect 9/11 to Isaiah 9:10, America to ancient Israel, and each would vow, "We will rebuild." Each unwittingly pronounces judgment on America. So 2 witnesses had spoken, but the scriptures speak of a third. So could there be a third witness? A third witness to confirm the connecting of the ancient prophecy to 9/11, but now also to the economic collapse. A third witness as a sign that the underlying course of judgment had not stopped, but had progressed to a further stage. Could there be a third witness to speak from an even higher level and on an even greater scale? Higher than the Senate Majority Leader, I asked. Do you know where we are? Capitol Hill. No, right here, on this terrace. No, I answered. This is the place where presidents are sworn into office. This is the place of the inauguration? The inauguration, an event filled with hope and expectancy. But in the case of a nation in departure from God and heading to judgment, hope can only come in repentance. Without a change of course, the end must remain the same, and all other hopes must fail. The third witness is? The third witness is the President of the United States. How? I asked. It's evening, he said. February 24th, 2009. The new president comes to this hill 1 month after his inauguration. He enters the chamber of the House of Representatives, makes his way down the aisle to the podium, and is greeted with thunderous applause. The nation's economy is still in a state of freefall, and a tangible sense of foreboding hangs over the future. Even before he utters his first word, the speech is being hailed as the most important address of his early presidency. It will be the first time he stands as president to address a joint session of Congress and the nation, and his moment to give America an answer to its greatest crisis since 9/11. The chamber quiets. He begins. Madam Speaker, Mr. Vice President, members of Congress, and the First Lady of the United States. I've come here tonight not only to address the distinguished men and women in this great chamber, but to speak frankly and directly. It was now dark as we spoke on the terrace. The monuments of the Washington Mall were aglow with white, yellow, and orange light, as was the Capitol building itself. The prophet continued. The words, "we will rebuild," had also manifested in the speech that launched the war on terror, the speech given by the former president. But in that case, the phrase was qualified and specific to the rebuilding of New York. But now the words would come forth with nothing to qualify or limit them. Simply, we will rebuild. Now an American president would proclaim the central declaration of Israel's fateful vow as the central declaration of his entire address. But with nothing to qualify it, I asked, how specifically could 3 words be linked to Isaiah 9:10? Good question, he replied. Imagine this experiment. Before the president's speech, you type in those 3 words into almost any major search engine on the internet. We will rebuild. Just those 3 words and nothing else. What would happen? The search engine would take you to the ancient prophecy. That specific verse would more than likely appear in the first pages of results, if not on the very first page. That's how specifically the 3 words are joined to the ancient prophecy. But now it's the night of the speech. You repeat the experiment and type in the same 3 words. But now, instead of taking you to the ancient vow, it takes you to the words of the American president. As the night advances, you repeat the experiment. Each time you do it, you witness the president's vow progressively pushing the ancient vow farther and farther away from the top of the list. Or, to put it another way, the vow of the American president now takes the place of the ancient vow. So the mystery was now playing out on the World Wide Web, before a global audience, through television, radio, print, and the internet, through the President of the United States, in the hearing of the nation and much of the world. And just as it was with the first 2 witnesses, the vow would once more manifest as the climax and pinnacle of the speech in which it appeared. How, I asked, without coming at the end of the speech? Where it appeared in the speech was irrelevant. The president's address was picked up by news services around the world. Each had to choose a phrase to serve as a summation and headline. From the thousands of words contained in that speech, the words most often chosen to encapsulate and represent it were those of the ancient vow. CBS News, Obama, we will rebuild. CNN, Obama, we will rebuild. MSNBC, Obama Tonight, we will rebuild. The Guardian, Obama, we will rebuild. National Public Radio, Obama pledges, we will rebuild. Times Online, Obama tells America, we will rebuild. Fox News, Obama says, country will rebuild. Al Jazeera, Obama pledges, U.S. will rebuild. Drudge Report, Obama says, USA will rebuild. Associated Press, Obama, we will rebuild. New York Times, Obama vows, we will rebuild. Isaiah 9:10, we will rebuild. From the New York Times to Al Jazeera, I said, they all chose the central declaration of Isaiah 9:10, with no one having any idea. No more than the one who proclaimed it had any idea. The same principle that caused the Harbingers to manifest in the first place was now operating through the global media. And notice something else, Noriel. The president didn't just say, we will rebuild. He prefaced it with this: I want every American to know this. We will rebuild. Does it sound familiar? It's the prophetic address, that which comes before a prophetic utterance, to identify the person or people to whom it's being sent. So the word was now being sent to every American. Correct, he answered. The ancient prophecy was addressed to the people of Israel, and all the people will know it. So now the President of the United States is readdressing it. It is now given for every American to know. And as with the other witnesses, he too clearly identifies who the we is of we will rebuild. The President is reciting the vow on behalf of every American. And by doing that, the President is in effect identifying America as a nation estranged from God, in defiance of his will and heading toward judgment. Yes, said the prophet, just as did the first two witnesses. In order for a truth or a judgment to be established, there must be 2 or 3 witnesses, and the testimony of each must be consistent with that of the others. To that end, the President added a second line to his vow. We will rebuild, we will recover. Why does it sound familiar, I asked. On the day after 9/11, when the ancient vow was first proclaimed from Capitol Hill, the Senate Majority Leader sealed the vow and his address with these words: we will rebuild and we will recover. So the President was repeating the words spoken on Capitol Hill, I said, the day after 9/11, but he couldn't have done it purposely. No, said the prophet, not purposely, but unknowingly, as with everything else. And notice, when the Senate Majority Leader proclaimed those 2 declarations, the words were not only being joined to the attack, but clearly to Isaiah 9:10. And now the President utters the same words, but now to speak of the economic collapse. So the same declaration spoken over the first shaking is now spoken over the second. The 2 events are again joined together, and it's all joined together by Isaiah 9:10. And they both made their proclamations in the same place. Yes, he said, the witnesses are joined together not only by their testimony, but also by the place in which they give their testimony. Each of the 3 witnesses proclaims the vow in the capital city. The first and third witness proclaim the vow not only in the same city, but also on the exact same hill, in the exact same building. And a building divided into 2 wings, 2 chambers, the Senate and the House, the nation's 2 highest legislative assemblies, each of which must confirm a law or proclamation in order for it to be passed, as with 2 witnesses. And so the ancient vow is proclaimed first from the floor of the Senate on the day after 9/11, and then from the floor of the House of Representatives, first from the northern wing and then from the southern, 1 in each wing, 1 in each chamber, 2 witnesses. And did the President say anything else that linked up with Isaiah 9:10? Yes, with Isaiah 9:10 and with the commentaries. When the leaders of ancient Israel declared, the bricks have fallen, but we will rebuild, what were they saying? Tell me. They were saying that fallen bricks would not decide their future. The crisis would not determine their nation's destiny. They themselves would. From the commentaries. The arrogant response demonstrates how stubborn and overconfident the people of Israel were. They thought they could determine their own destiny. So after declaring we will rebuild, the president gave voice to another declaration. The weight of this crisis will not determine the destiny of this nation. It's the bricks have fallen, but we will rebuild, translated into modern political terminology. And what did he say would determine the nation's destiny, I asked. America would be its own answer. The answers to our problems don't lie beyond our reach. They exist in our laboratories and universities, in our fields and our factories, in the imagination of our entrepreneurs and the pride of the hardest working people on earth. In other words, we will emerge from this crisis by relying on the greatness of our powers and resources. We will rebuild with quarried stones, I said, and cedar trees. Exactly, he replied. We will determine our own destiny. And yet the ancient vow boasted of more than that, more than rebuilding, and more than recovering. It was about coming out of the crisis stronger than before. Exactly. And so the president would add one more declaration to his vow. Listen to the words. We will rebuild, we will recover, and the United States of America will emerge stronger than before. A perfect summation of the ancient prophecy. Now look what happens if you take the words of the president and hold them up against the words of a commentary on Isaiah 9:10. From the commentary, they boasted that they would rebuild their devastated country. From the president, we will rebuild, we will recover. The commentary, and make it stronger and more glorious than ever before. The president, and the United States of America will emerge stronger than before. It's scary, I said, how closely it matches. Much scarier, said the prophet, is what it all led to in the ancient case. And in the modern case, I asked? The answer to the nation's problems, he said, lies not in its powers, but in a power much higher than these. And until and unless that answer and hope are found, every other answer and hope must fail in the end, and the prophecy must continue in effect, along with the progression of judgment. The progression of judgment, so things only get worse? In the realm of appearance, not always. What followed 9/11 appeared to be an era of economic resurgence and expansion, but in reality, it was a house of cards. A very different dynamic was at work beneath the surface, and progressing, until the cards collapsed. The Isaiah 9:10 effect. The progression of judgment advances in times of calamity and crisis, but equally in times of apparent recovery, apparent normalcy, and even apparent resurgence, booming economies, and prosperity. None of it hinders or ends the progression. Whether above the surface or beneath it, the progression continues. Then what ends the progression, I asked? Either judgment or the answer. And it's heading to which? To which end do you think, Noria? It's heading away from God. The progression of judgment is only a reaction to the progression of a nation's apostasy, its progressive severing of its connection to God and to the biblical foundation on which it was established. If the first progression doesn't end, then neither can the second. So the answer is? The seal, he replied. The answer is the seal? May I have the seal, he asked. So I gave it to him, and he placed another in my right hand. This, he said, is what I gave you at the beginning, the seal of the first Harbinger. We now leave the mysteries of the second shaking and move to the answer. And as this was the seal that opened up the first mysteries of the Harbingers, so too it will open up the last, and the answer. And this one is like all the other revelations, or not? This one, he said, is unlike all the other revelations. And yet all of them are joined to it. And where does one go to find its meaning, I asked. Its meaning lies hidden in the foundation. The foundation of what? America. Where? In the mystery ground. Chapter 19. The Mystery Ground. The seal of the first Harbinger, said Anna, was of what again? The breach, he replied. The opening in the wall, the removal of the hedge of protection. But there had to be something else about it, something you didn't notice at the beginning. Exactly. And did you find it? Yes, after examining it carefully, yes. It actually took a magnifying glass to make out the details. And what was it? A very, very minute image at the bottom right-hand corner of the wall, a rectangle, a vertical rectangle, with a series of points running along the top as if some sort of crown. And what did you make of it, she asked. At first, nothing more than that, a crown on a box. And what would a crown on a box signify? I had no idea, he said. So I went searching through countless books, collections, and compilations on symbols and imagery. But nothing appeared to match, nothing that made any sense. And then I found it, by accident. Not by accident, but by what appeared to be an accident at the time. I've lost my faith in accidents. So what happened? I was home, watching a documentary on ancient mysteries on television. And then it appeared on the screen. The crown on the box? Yes. And what was it? The Temple of Jerusalem. If you approached it from the front, that's what it would look like, a vertical rectangle with a line of golden spikes on top. And what did you make of it? There was the temple, and there was the breach. So putting it together, a breach in the temple. A breach in the Temple of Jerusalem? It couldn't have been the Temple of Jerusalem, he replied. Not literally. The mystery concerned America. So I took the temple to be the representation of a holy place, a church, a synagogue, a shrine, some holy place. A breach in a holy place? Yes. So I began searching for anything having to do with a breach in a house of worship, and of significance for America. And after much searching, nothing. So I returned to Battery Park. Why, she asked. Because it was there that the prophet first revealed the meaning of that first seal. And nothing. Time passed. I was growing discouraged. And then something happened. A clue came to me, in a way nothing had ever come to me before. What do you mean? A dream. It came to me in a dream. Interesting. It was a dream of the Temple of Jerusalem. The day was sunny. The temple courts were filled with people, multitudes. Thousands and thousands of people dressed in robes, all gathered for some sort of event, some celebration. There was a procession. In the procession was a golden object. It had to be the Ark of the Covenant. How did you know it was the Ark of the Covenant, she asked. I've seen the movies, he replied. There were musicians playing trumpets and harps and sounding cymbals as the people sang in worship. A cloud filled the temple. Not a regular cloud, but some kind of supernatural cloud of radiance. There was a man standing on some sort of platform near the temple. He turned around to face the multitudes and began addressing them. It was the king, King Solomon. And how did you know it was King Solomon? He was wearing a crown and what seemed to be a royal robe of gold, and I just knew, the way you just know things in a dream, intuitively. So King Solomon was speaking to the crowd and saying what? I couldn't tell or understand, but after he finished speaking, he turned back toward the temple, knelt down, covered his head with the golden robe, and lifted his hands to the sky. He was praying. He was leading the people in prayer. And as they prayed, I was walking through their midst, through crowds, toward the platform where the king was kneeling. I approached him. He was now just a few feet away from me, but I could only see him from the back since he was turned in the opposite direction. He stood up, still facing the temple, and with the golden robe still covering his head. And then he turned around. I saw his face, and it wasn't him. What do you mean it wasn't him? She asked. It wasn't King Solomon anymore, he answered. Then who was it? It was Washington. Washington? As in the president? Washington, said Noriel, as in George. He let the robe fall to his side, and he stood there on the platform, looking just as you'd picture him, a white powdered wig, a dark brown waistcoat and breeches, white silk stockings, and dark shoes with silver buckles. He lifted up both hands to the heavens, just as Solomon had done, closed his eyes, and began to pray. When he finished praying, he opened his eyes and lowered his right hand, as if reaching for something in front of him, but there was nothing there. Then a sheet of paper descended from the sky and landed in his left hand, which was still raised upward. Just at that moment, he lowered his glance and appeared to be looking directly into my eyes. He then descended the steps of the platform and walked over to the temple, still holding the paper in his hand. When he reached the corner of the building, he bent down and slipped the paper into one of the cracks in between two massive stones, where it disappeared. As it disappeared, he faded away. I looked around toward the multitude, but they too were gone. And then what? Then I was alone, standing in the temple courts. The sky began to darken. The winds began blowing stronger and stronger. It seemed that time itself was accelerating faster and faster until all around me was a whirlwind of action, events and sound, an intense blur of sight and sound as the sky continued to darken and darken until it was almost as dark as night. Whatever was happening didn't seem to be a good thing. And then it was over, as if a violent storm had just passed through. The darkness began to break, and everything was growing brighter. But when I turned back to see the temple, it was gone. It was in ruins, its massive stones scattered on the mount. Everything was destroyed. It was then that I noticed a man turned away from me, a man in a golden robe. The golden robe of King Solomon? Yes. He was standing in the same place where Washington stood before he disappeared, at the corner of the temple. Except that now there was no corner and no temple, only ruins. But it was the same place. At the man's feet was a sheet of paper, the paper that had been hidden inside the stones. But the destruction had caused it to be revealed. He bent down to pick it up. I felt I had to approach him, and as I did, he turned around. And it was him. Solomon? No. Washington? No. Then who? It was the prophet. The prophet? The golden robe dropped to his side, revealing his long, dark coat. He looked into my eyes, then handed me the paper. I took it into my hands and looked down to see what it said. And what did it say? She asked. I don't know. Why not? Because I woke up. Bad timing, she replied. I don't know, he said. I think it was meant to happen just as it did. The mystery you were seeking. The prophet told you it was hidden in the foundation. So the paper in the dream, it was hidden in the wall of a building. That struck me as well, he replied. So you believed the dream was significant? A sign? I did. So what did you make of it? It all centered on the temple. The temple was on the seal. The seal was about a breach, the removal of protection, destruction. The dream involved the destruction of the temple. But what about George Washington, she asked. What would be the meaning of his appearance? Solomon was the king of Israel. Washington was the first president of the United States. There was something in the linking of ancient Israel and America, as with all the other mysteries. And the paper? As you said, the mystery hidden in the foundation, a message concerning America, waiting to be uncovered. So where did it all lead you? I had no idea where it was all leading me. And then it hit me. Washington! Washington hid the mystery. So the mystery was hidden in Washington, the city, the nation's foundation. And the temple was in Jerusalem, which was the capital. The mystery again pointed to the capital city. So I returned to Washington, D.C. But looking for what this time? For any connection to the temple or King Solomon. But the search came up with nothing. So I expanded it to include any house of worship of significance. But again, nothing. So I expanded it again to include now any place with a specific connection to George Washington, the Washington Monument, the statue in the middle of the Capitol Rotunda, and, again, nothing. So finally I just went searching everywhere, the Smithsonian, the Jefferson Memorial, the Supreme Court, everywhere, and, yet again, nothing. So how long were you there in Washington? Several weeks, and then I gave up. I returned home discouraged. The dream appeared to be filled with clues, but there was nothing to connect any of them to anything meaning anything. So I returned again to the only place with a definite connection to the seal. Battery Park? Yes. And that's where I was standing, by the water's edge, watching a seagull in the sky, when I heard the voice again from behind me. The prophet? The prophet. You haven't given up, he said, have you, Nuriel? Why, does it look like I have? I asked. I didn't say it did, he replied. You know, there's a fine line, I said, between giving up and having absolutely nothing to go on. So you think you have absolutely nothing to go on? It's not that I think I have absolutely nothing to go on, but what I do have to go on doesn't go anywhere. Then tell me, what do you have? The Temple of Jerusalem, the capital city, a breach, a holy place, destruction, Washington, D.C. And nothing else? That's about it. Why don't we go for a little walk? So we began walking, first through Battery Park, and then out into the streets of Lower Manhattan. The Temple of Jerusalem was the house of God's glory, said the prophet. But in 586 B.C., after centuries of apostasy and with no hope of return, the Lord finally allowed his house to be touched by judgment and destroyed. The temple and the breach, the destruction of the temple, that much I had right. The temple was the focal point of the nation's life. So the focal point of the nation's judgment would be the temple's destruction. Exactly. So as went the temple, so went the nation. For good or bad, when the temple's construction was completed by King Solomon, the kingdom itself was complete. Solomon. And when he dedicated it to God, it was the nation as well that was dedicated. I saw it, I said, my voice rising in pitch. What do you mean? He asked. That's what it was in the dream, the dedication of the temple. I had a dream, and it began with Solomon leading a gathering of multitudes at the temple. Interesting, said the prophet. Tell me, what exactly did Solomon do on the day he dedicated the temple? He gathered the nation and its leaders to Jerusalem. He addressed the gathering, reminding them of how faithful God had been to the nation. Then he offered up prayers for the future generations. Solomon was looking into the nation's future, foreseeing its coming departure from God and its consequences. The consequences being the removal of God's favor from the land, said the prophet, the withdrawal of his blessings, the nation's hedge of protection, national calamity. And it all happened, I asked? Yes. The prayers of King Solomon were prophetic, but he wasn't only foretelling what would happen to those future generations. He was also praying on their behalf, in light of what would happen, for God's mercy and for restoration. So he was praying in view of calamities which hadn't even happened? That was the point. It wasn't only the temple that was being dedicated on that day, but the nation's future, its generations yet to be born. The Temple Mount was the nation's ground of dedication. I saw it all in my dream. And after the dedication, the sky turned dark and something like a storm was coming. And at the end of the storm, the temple was destroyed. There was nothing left but ruins. Which is exactly what happened. A spiritual darkness engulfed the land, and the nation departed from God. And then after years and years of mercy, the judgment fell. And that judgment was only complete when it touched the Temple Mount, the same place where the nation's future had been consecrated to God, the same place its apostasy had been foretold. The Lord had allowed the judgment to strike the nation's most sacred ground, the ground of its consecration. This, Nuriel, is a critical principle. Take note of it. When judgment comes to such a nation, once committed to God and once consecrated to his purposes, but now departed from his ways, the judgment will return to its ground of consecration. Or to put it more concisely, the nation's ground of consecration will become the ground of its judgment. Why? I asked. The Temple Mount represented the nation's covenant with God, so its destruction was the ultimate sign that the covenant was broken. Yet even in that there was mercy. It was a sign that God was calling the nation back to remember the ground of its dedication and consecration to Him, the foundation on which all of its blessings rested. So it was both a sign of judgment, I said, and a prophetic message calling the nation back to return to the foundation. Correct. I took out the seal to look at it once more. But what does it all have to do with America, I asked. On the day after 9/11, he said, the Senate Majority Leader recited the words of the ancient prophecy at the end of his speech. But at the beginning of that speech, he cited a number. He said, "It is with pain, sorrow, anger, and resolve that I stand before this Senate, a symbol for 212 years of the strength of our democracy." Notice the number, Noriel. 212. It was given to connect 9/11 to the founding of the American government, the establishment of the American nation-state. Do the math. 2001 minus 212 years comes to 1789. Correct, 1789. But I thought America was founded in 1776. The year 1776 was the year America declared its independence. It would be several years before that independence became a reality, and several more years before there was a constitution upon which the nation would be established. America as we know it, with a president, a Senate, and a House of Representatives, only came into existence in 1789. More specifically, it came into existence on April 30th, 1789, the day when, for the first time, all these were in place, America's first day as a fully constituted nation. What happened on April 30th? It was the day that the nation's government was completed, as set forth in the Constitution, the day America's first president was inaugurated. George Washington. Yes, he was part of it too, I said. He was there in the dream, at the dedication of the temple. First it was King Solomon, and then it was Washington. Why do you think that was, Noriel? Why was Washington in my dream? Yes. Tell me. It wasn't my dream. I don't know, I said. A sign that it had something to do with America. What was he doing in your dream? Leading the people in prayer like Solomon. And then he stretched out his hand as if reaching for something. Like this? The prophet stretched forth his hand, with his palm turned down. Yes, exactly like that. How did you... But he wasn't so much reaching for something. His palm was turned down. Then what was he doing, I asked. He was placing his hand on a Bible, said the prophet, to swear. He was taking the oath of the presidency. It was the inauguration, April 30th, 1789, the beginning of America as a constituted nation, the foundation 212 years before 9/11. The inauguration of George Washington on the Temple Mount? In your dream, the two events were joined together, Israel's dedication and America's inauguration, the one superimposed on the other. Why? It was your dream. You tell me. Because somehow the 2 days are connected? But how? Asked the prophet. What would they have in common? The dedication of the temple was also an inauguration, I said. And the inauguration of the American government would also be a type of dedication. Each was an opening day and a day of completion. Each represented the completion of a structure, the structure of a nation. And each involved the nation gathering together. Gathering together where? In the nation's capital? And who presided over each gathering? The nation's leader, the king, the president. And in your dream, did King Solomon speak? Yes. What did he say? I don't know. King Solomon began his address by acknowledging God's hand and faithfulness in the nation's history. So on America's inauguration day, the nation's first president would do likewise. In the first ever presidential address, this is what he said. No people can be bound to acknowledge and adore the invisible hand which conducts the affairs of men more than those of the United States. Every step by which they have advanced to the character of an independent nation seems to have been distinguished by some token a providential agency. As he addressed the people in the days of the dedication, King Solomon offered up prayers and supplications to the Almighty, interceding for the Lord's blessing on the nation's future. Now listen to the words of Washington's first presidential address. It would be peculiarly improper to omit in this first official act my fervent supplications to that Almighty Being who rules over the universe, who presides in the councils of nations, and whose providential aids can supply every human defect, that his benediction may consecrate to the liberties and happiness of the people of the United States a government instituted by themselves for these essential purposes. In my dream, Solomon was praying. Then Washington took his place but continued praying. The two leaders, the two events were superimposed, so that's why. And it wasn't just Solomon who was praying for the nation's future, he said, but all the leaders and multitudes who were gathered on the Temple Mount, everyone. So too it was on America's inauguration. It was designated as a day of prayer and dedication. This was the proclamation that went forth. On the morning of the day on which our illustrious president will be invested with his office, the bells will ring at 9 o'clock, when the people may go up to the house of God, and in a solemn manner commit the new government with its important train of consequences to the holy protection and blessing of the Most High. An early hour is prudently fixed for this peculiar act of devotion, and is designed wholly for prayer. So on the morning of April 30th, 1789, the sound of bells filled the nation's capital for 30 minutes, calling the people to go up to the house of God, to commit the new government to the holy protection and blessing of the Most High. As for the nation's first president and government, it would be later that same day that they would gather for prayer to commit the future into God's hands, at a place especially chosen for that purpose. So after the new president finished delivering the first presidential address, he would lead the Senate and the House of Representatives on foot in a procession through the streets of the Capitol, from Federal Hall, the site of the inauguration, to the place appointed for their prayers. And what was the place appointed, I asked. A little stone church. So the first official act of the newly formed government took place inside the walls of a church. That's correct, he replied. The nation's first president, Senate, and House of Representatives were all there inside that little stone sanctuary. The gathering would be recorded in the annals of Congress as part of the first ever joint session of Congress with an acting president. The inauguration of the United States as we know it began with a sacred gathering before God. So the first collective act of the newly formed American government was to gather for prayer. To gather for prayer, undoubtedly to give thanks, and specifically to commit the future into the holy protection and blessing of the Most High. Just then we came to a stop at a street corner. It's time, he said. It's time to uncover the last piece of the mystery. To do that, we must identify the ground. The ground? The ground on which America was committed in prayer to God that first day. But there's something I'm not getting, I said. All this happened in the capital city, correct? That's correct, he replied. Then what are we doing here? I asked. We were there in Washington, D.C., on Capitol Hill, even on the terrace where the presidents are inaugurated. Why didn't you show me this then when we were there? And even after that, when I returned to Washington, I was there for weeks and you never showed up. But you show up now. I don't understand. You were right, Noriel, he said. The mystery is linked to the Capitol. You just came up with the wrong one. What do you mean, wrong one? When the nation began, its capital city wasn't Washington, D.C. On April 30th, 1789, the city of Washington didn't exist. Then what was America's original capital city, I asked. You're standing in it, he replied. New York? New York City? The first capital of the United States was New York City. That's where it all took place. Washington was sworn in as president in New York City? Yes, he replied. Now I have someone to show you. Someone? He took me around the corner and down the street. There was a statue in the distance. Do you recognize him? He asked. Washington? Correct. It was the dark bronze statue of George Washington that stands on Wall Street, facing the New York Stock Exchange. We drew nearer, coming to a stop just short of the platform on which it rested. From there we gazed up at the dark, stoic figure. My dream, I said. This is exactly how he looked in my dream. He wasn't as big, but I was looking up at him the same way, from the same angle, and his right hand was extended just like that, and turned downward just like that, he said, to rest on the Bible. I went all around Washington, D.C., looking for anything connected to him, a statue, a monument, a clue, and this one didn't even occur to me. And why should it have, he replied. You're a New Yorker. Just because something's right in front of your eyes doesn't mean you have to see it. Washington never set foot in Washington, D.C., but he set foot here. This is where it all began. This is where the United States of America as we know it came into existence. New York City. In New York City, and here. Here? Here, he replied, as in right here. There's an inscription on the pedestal. Read it, Noriel. Read it out loud. So I did. On this site, in Federal Hall, April 30th, 1789, George Washington took the oath as the first President of the United States of America. On this site. I've seen this statue so many times and never stopped to think about why it was here. Here is where it all happened, April 30th, 1789. The streets and rooftops are overflowing with people. Washington places his hand on the Bible and swears the oath. The crowd breaks out in cheers. Cannons boom and bells ring out across the city. Then he withdraws into Federal Hall, where he delivers the first presidential address before Congress. After that, he leads the nation's first government on foot in a procession to the little stone sanctuary to commit the nation's future in prayer to God. Where? I asked. That's the key, he replied. The key to the mystery? I asked. Yes. It would be the ground on which the nation was committed to God, the nation's ground of consecration. Correct. So it would have to be somewhere in New York City. A safe assumption. And if we're standing on the site where the inauguration took place, and they went by foot to the appointed place, then it couldn't be far from here. No, it couldn't be, he replied. And that's where I stopped, instead of following it through to its logical conclusion. Why? Asked Anna. Why would you stop just then? Because I wasn't sure I was ready to see it, or to know what the answer was. But you were searching for it all along, she said. Yes, he replied, but it was never within my grasp before that moment. Did you ever get so close to something you were searching for, and when you know you're just about to find it, when it's in your reach, you're not sure you're ready to find it? I think I understand, she said. That's what it was. I knew it was something very big, very central, and very important, but I wasn't sure I was ready to find it. So what happened? She asked. The prophet didn't give me a choice. Come, Noriel, he said. It's time to see the place where it all happened, America's ground of consecration. Let's follow in their steps as the president led them through the streets of the city on foot to the appointed place. Let's go. So we walked down Wall Street, and then on to another. I could picture it all as it happened 2 centuries earlier. Washington, the first senators, the first representatives, the first cabinet, America's first government, all heading to the sacred gathering. But it was now just me and the prophet, retracing the journey. Not that there weren't others on those same streets. There were, of course, but not with the same purpose. I was silent the entire time, as was he. And then he stopped and turned to me. There it is, Noriel, he said, pointing to a building across the street. There it is, the place where America was dedicated to God. The place was surrounded by a dark wrought iron fence. Is that the same little stone church? Yes, he answered. The building was distinctive looking, and yet, at the same time, in view of what it represented, inconspicuous. In the front was a columned, classical-looking facade, In the back was a steeple, tall, narrow, and more what you'd expect to find in an old church building. You might not even notice it, I said. What you're looking at, Noriel, is St. Paul's Chapel. It stands now much as it did on April 30th, 1789, when America's first government entered through its doors. It was here that the nation's first president, Senate, and House of Representatives bowed together in prayer to consecrate the new nation's future into the hands of God. This is the place where the new nation was committed to the Almighty. This is America's ground of consecration. Then he was silent, letting me take it in. But I knew that wasn't the end of it. I knew there was something to be revealed, something he was holding back from telling me. Originally it faced the other way, he said. Its front was in the back, its main entrance was on the other side. Let's continue our walk. So we crossed the street and walked along the sidewalk that lined the church's iron fence to our right. Within the iron fence was an old courtyard. As we walked, I found myself unable to stop peering through the bars at the trees, the grass, and the ancient-looking gravestones inside, looking for something significant in the mystery. I was still gazing into the courtyard as we neared the rear corner of the property. In the early days, the prophet said, this is what you'd walk through to enter the sanctuary. He allowed me just a few moments before speaking again. Turn around, Noriel, he said. I was so focused on what was inside the fence that I didn't notice what was surrounding it. You're missing it, he said in a more somber tone. It's right here and you're missing it. Turn around. So I turned around. Look, he said. When I saw it, I was stunned to the point of almost losing my balance. Do you know what you're looking at? It's not what? It's not. What is it that it's not? Ground zero. But it is ground zero. Ground zero. The last piece of the mystery. America's consecration ground, he said. Ground zero, I repeated, unable at that moment to say anything else. America, he said, was committed to God at the corner of what would become ground zero. It was here, at ground zero, that they all gathered. George Washington, John Adams, America's founding fathers, they all came here to the corner of ground zero to pray on the day that America's foundation was laid. As the consecrating act of that foundation, it was here that they came to commit the nation's future to God's holy protection, and it was here where that holy protection would be withdrawn. I removed the seal from my coat pocket to once more examine its image. It was then that its meaning hit me with a new and stark clarity. The sacred ground, the nation's hedge of protection broken, and the ancient principle, the ground of dedication becomes the ground of calamity. The judgment returns to the ground of consecration. And literally so, said the prophet, as the massive white cloud, born of the destruction, literally engulfed the little chapel, and the debris and ashes of the falling towers covered its soil. So on this ground is hidden a national mystery. This is the mystery you spoke of, and in my dream, hidden in America's foundation. The prophet pointed into the distance. Had we been there on that day of inauguration, everything over there, everything beyond that point would have been water. But between here and the water was a field, now known as Ground Zero, a field owned by a church. Ground Zero was originally church land. Owned by what church, I asked. The same that operated out of St. Paul's Chapel. So then it was, in essence, one property as one ground. As one ground, he replied. As one ground on the day America was consecrated there. Thus, it's not only that America's ground of consecration is at Ground Zero,